Whether or not we are alone in the universe is one of the oldest and biggest of the big questions of existence. And for most of human history, it lay entirely within the provinces of theology and philosophy. But about 60 years ago, science began to make its own contribution. And the reason for that was the growth in what is now called radio astronomy. In the 1950s, the new radio astronomers realized that with these big dishes, they had instruments with the power to communicate not just across terrestrial distances, but interstellar distances. And a few brave souls dared to suggest that if we are not alone in the universe, that if it turns out there are extraterrestrial civilizations, maybe more in advance of our own, then it's just possible they would be using such instruments to communicate with each other, and who knows, even be sending messages for mankind. And that although it was an extraordinarily long shot to imagine that we may pick up those messages, if nobody tried, then we could be certain that we never would. And the challenge was taken up in April 1960 by a young American astronomer called Frank Drake. I think here he is, rather grainy photograph. And thus began the project which is known in the trade as SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And it addresses the question of, is there anybody out there? And if there is, how might we go about making contact? And some of you may have even seen the movie Contact, starring Jodie Foster, based on the novel by Carl Sagan of the same name. So 56 years on, what do we have to show for it? A handful of astronomers, not many, have been scouring the skies with their radio telescopes in the hope of stumbling across a message from ET. But sadly, after all this time, there is nothing but an eerie silence. So is it the case that we're simply looking for the wrong thing in the wrong place at the wrong time? It seems a very good opportunity for us to take stock and reevaluate how it is we can answer that question, are we alone in the universe? And for a field that has been privately funded but impoverished for several decades, it was an astonishing turnaround when just over a year ago, the philanthropist Yuri Milner, at a meeting at the Royal Society in London, along with Stephen Hawking, you'll recognize there, and a now aging Frank Drake, still in the game at the age of 80-something, announced $100 million to be devoted to a project called Breakthrough Listen, which is really an attempt to reinvigorate this use of radio telescopes to tune into the aliens. It was accompanied a few months later by another project called Breakthrough Starshot. This is a very audacious attempt to address the question of not necessarily intelligent life, but life elsewhere within our galaxy by sending a swarm of microchips at 20% of the speed of light to the nearest star system called Alpha Centauri. And this is to be accomplished, if it happens, it's a very ambitious project, by powerful ground-based lasers to shoot beams of light into space and to zap little parachute-like entities to which would be tethered these 1-gram payloads that would reach within minutes 20% of the speed of light and would reach Alpha Centauri in just 20 years. So that's in the lifetime of at least some people in this room. An extraordinarily exciting prospect. We shall have to see whether it happens. So the breakthrough initiatives, and if anyone's interested, the person running them is giving a lecture at Arizona State University this evening. These breakthrough initiatives look set to rekindle some powerful new thinking about the age-old question of whether or not we are alone in the universe. And it is age-old. It goes back actually thousands of years, but is particularly noted for what happened to Giordano Bruno, who speculated that there are other worlds out there that, like Earth, contain animals and inhabitants. This didn't go down too well with the authorities of the time, and he was burnt at the stake, as though my theologian friends chide me always to say that wasn't the main reason, the notion of other inhabited worlds. He said lots of other questionable things about the Catholic Church at the time. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that speculation about the existence of other inhabited worlds goes back hundreds of years. And there was a lively debate in the 16th, 17th centuries about the nature of these extraterrestrial beings and where they may be located. Then things began to be put on a more scientific basis. And seeing as this is Arizona, I can't resist mentioning the Lowell Observatory, which was built at Flagstaff by Percival Lowell in 1894, specifically to look for intelligent life on Mars. Lowell was convinced, along with a number of others, that Mars was inhabited by beings who could build canals. And he made a map of the canals of Mars, or made several maps. Here's one from his book, published around the turn of the 20th century. And this somewhat awkward construction, not a natural writer, that Mars is inhabited by beings of some sort or other we may consider as certain as it is uncertain what these beings may be. And this gave the backdrop to H.G. Wells' famous War of the Worlds story written about the same time. And so there was that feeling that based on the new astronomy with powerful instruments, that it would be possible to discover signs of intelligent life even within our solar system. Well, fast forward to the era of space exploration, and sadly, the surface of Mars has no canals. In fact, it's a freeze-dried desert that is bathed in ultraviolet radiation, and as Elton John might say, not the kind of place to raise a kid. It is not impossible that some form of microbial life is there on or beneath the Martian surface, but intelligent canal-building Martians seem out of the question. And the same is true for the other planets within our solar system. So we have to look farther afield if we are to encounter anything beyond the level of microbes. And that's okay, because this satellite in particular, called the Kepler satellite, this particular mission, looks for what are called extrasolar planets. These are planets going around other stars in our galaxy, just like Earth and our retinue of planets goes around the sun. They can be detected. It's very hard with present instruments to say very much about those planets apart from their mass and orbital period. But the hope is within at least a couple of decades, it may be possible to have telescopes powerful enough not just to image these planets, but to get spectra from the atmospheres and look for the telltale signs of life on them. But of course, what we're interested in really is not just life, but intelligent life. And so that raises the whole question of what does it take for an Earth-like planet to have something like a civilization of the sort with which we're familiar. Now, there are many estimates out there. I should say the technology does not yet enable us to directly see Earth-like planets going around Sun-like stars, but you can sort of infer from the statistics how many there might be. And you'll see these estimates of billions in our galaxy alone, and there's hundreds of billions of galaxies. So there's no lack of real estate in the universe on which life, and indeed intelligent life, might arise. However, a lot of people, including some distinguished scientists, conflate habitable with inhabited. A habitable world only becomes inhabited by life if a transition is made from non-life to life. That is, there has to be a process that takes a mishmash of chemicals and turns it into a living thing. What was that process, and how likely is it to happen there as it happened here on Earth? Well, when I was a student, and that was many decades ago, in fact, I was a student in London back in what we called then the swinging 60s, and I was really interested in looking, or the idea of looking, for life beyond Earth. And one might as well have professed an interest in looking for fairies. It was considered self-evidently absurd. It was known that life is so stupendously complex that the chances of it popping up again somewhere else were infinitesimal. So Francis, Mr. DNA Crick, wrote, for example, life seems almost a miracle. So many other conditions necessary for it to get going. But 20 or 30 years later, the pendulum had decisively swung. And by the mid-1990s, Christian de Duve, another Nobel Prize-winning biologist, was able to write life is almost bound to arise wherever physical conditions are similar to Earth. And he coined a ringing phrase, I think it's a wonderful one, life is a cosmic imperative. I would love to believe that we lived in a universe in which the laws of physics were so rigged in favor of life that somehow it's inevitable that it's going to occur and occur all over the place. But what is the justification for this shift in mood? Had the science progressed? Do we now understand the mechanism whereby life arises from non-life? Or was this just a pendulum of fashion? Well, it's interesting to note the fact that Charles Darwin himself refused to be pressed on the question of how life came into being. He gave us a wonderful theory about how once life gets going, it, over billions of years, slowly accumulates greater and greater complexity. So you can go from microbes to humans in the space of about 3 or 4 billion years. But he refused to be drawn on how life got started in the first place. In fact, he said it's mere rubbish thinking at present of the origin of life. One might as well think about the origin of matter. And the point I want to make is a very simple point. If you don't know the process that turned non-life into life, it's impossible to estimate the odds. So we have no idea whether the universe is teeming with life or whether it is restricted just to Earth, that we are indeed alone in the universe. Notice that once life gets started, we still don't know how to compute how likely it is it goes from microbes to intelligent radio telescope communicating communities, but at least we understand the mechanism. It's called Darwinian evolution. We don't understand the mechanism that turns non-life into life. Could have been a bizarre fluke, or it could be chemically inevitable. We can't estimate the odds. So how can we test this hypothesis of the cosmic imperative? Well, obviously what we need is a second sample of life. If we could show that life had happened twice, that's good enough. You know, at the moment we've just got one sample, but two would make the point. Well, we can ask, what is the most Earth-like planet that we know? It is, of course, Earth itself. So if life does pop up readily in Earth-like conditions, shouldn't it have started many times over right here on our home planet? How do we know it didn't? Has anybody actually looked? And astonishingly, nobody has, at least until I started hexering them about this about 10 years ago, that we really should take into account the possibility that life on Earth is not all the same life, as the textbooks will say. There isn't just one tree of life, there could be another tree of life, but this other tree would have microbes only. And the point about microbes is you can't tell by looking what they're made of. They all look the same, just little blobs. You've got to delve into their biochemical innards to figure out what makes them tick. And it's not impossible that intermingled among the microbial realm that we know are organisms which are life, but life not as we know it, an independent form of life with a second genesis that began right here on our home planet. Sometimes called the shadow biosphere. And I think we should go look for that shadow biosphere to see if maybe the origin of life is not as hard as we originally thought. But to get back to the subject that I think interests most people, which is intelligent, not just microbial life, but intelligent life, is there a reason for this eerie silence? Well, there's one very obvious reason, and that is if you ask a SETI optimist, and say Frank Drake, who after 55, 56 years in the game is still upbeat about the prospects of success, if you ask him, well, you know, you just sort of in your wildest dreams, how close would the nearest civilization be? And he says, well, about 1,000 light years. Now, if the aliens are 1,000 light years away over there, they don't see Earth as it is today. They see it as it was 1,000 years ago. And there were no radio telescopes here. So it would make no sense for them to be beaming messages deliberately at Earth just so they could arrive in time for when we first turn our radio telescopes on the sky, we pick up those first messages. They may know from their instruments, they may know that there is intelligent life on Earth. 1,000 years ago, there were signs of intelligent activity. Just think of the Great Wall of China. They may know that, they may know that any millennium soon we would have radio technology, but it just wouldn't make sense for them to deliberately beam messages at us. So I think we have to get away from the idea of looking for a message and look instead for any telltale signatures of alien technology, anything fishy out there in space that would give the game away. And here's one example. If you saw that, or if you saw something like that, you'd think immediately, aha, doesn't seem like that has a natural explanation. Now, you'd be jolly lucky to see something like this, but there is a type of object that Freeman Dyson suggested back in the 1960s, often called a Dyson Sphere. And he reasoned that an energy-hungry super civilization might resort to dismembering its own planetary system and turning it into a sphere that would trap all of the radiation from its star to run its industry. So it's called a Dyson Sphere, and it would have a distinctive infrared signature. And a handful of astronomers has looked to see if they found any Dyson spheres. Nobody took it too seriously. But just a few months ago, there were news reports that maybe a Dyson sphere has been found, though not, I should say, an entire sphere, but a whole lot of funny stuff going around a star which has this unexciting name, KIC 8462852. It's 1,500 light years away, and it's got something going around it which is not a planet, not a comet, not a swarm of comets. Nobody knows quite what. And so there's speculation that this is a botched Dyson sphere or something of that sort. Here's something else that a colleague of mine drew my attention to. It's called Discus star. I was actually in Szczecin in Poland last week, and somebody kindly pronounced this for me, but I've forgotten. Anyway, it's a star 410 light years away, and this star, astonishingly, has got all of these radioactive elements in it. That this is a complete mystery as to how this may have happened, because the sun, for example, is hydrogen and helium and just a little bit of other stuff, but short-lived or even long-lived radioactive elements in a star is something we don't know about. So is this some sort of alien nuclear industry? Do they have the concession for that part of the galaxy? Are they licensing the dumping of alien nuclear waste? Is it a SETI project? Are they trying to signal? Or is it just some student project gone wrong? Who knows? But before leaving the subject of radio SETI, I want to point out that even if there are no directed radio messages coming at us, there's another type of radio signal we might detect, analogous to a lighthouse. A lighthouse sweeps the horizon of the ocean, not because it's directed at any particular ship, but just for the benefit of anybody who's out there. Is it possible that a distant ancient civilization has built a beacon, either laser or radio beacon, at the center or near the center of the galaxy that's sweeping the plane of the galaxy, and that if we just stare hard enough in one spot, we might pick up a transient radio pulse, a blip, rather than an actual signal like tuning into a radio station. And there's a tantalizing clue, because in 1977, something of this sort was detected at a telescope called the Big Ear, and back in the days, it wasn't that long ago, but in those days, the output from any sort of electronic system was in terms of either punch tape or these numbers on sheets of paper, and the operator looked at this sometime afterwards and noted this sort of funny thing here and wrote "wow" in the margin. And so there was a powerful, still unexplained, radio pulse coming from a particular region of the galaxy. Nobody's detected anything from there since. So it's, of course, known as the wow signal. So you see, we're in a curious situation. There are a few tantalizing clues. We may not be alone, but we still don't know how non-life turned into life. We still don't know if we are just freaks, the result of a stupendously improbable accident that's happened only once in the universe, or if it really is teeming with life, and there are alien civilizations scattered all around the galaxy and beyond, waiting to signal us, and we should look for evidence of their existence. But you might get the impression, I think correctly, that this is really a needle in a haystack search without any guarantee there's any needle there. Why do we do it? Why is Yuri Milner committing $200 million to this project? And I think the answer is, and we share it, I think the fact that you're here today listening to me, haven't walked out yet, is that we're all fascinated by the idea that there are advanced alien beings out there, maybe well in advance of our own. And that in that sense, what we're trying to answer is who are we and where do we fit into the universe? And I would just finish with Frank Drake's own take on that. SETI is a search for ourselves, really, who we are and where we fit into the universe. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.